Christian parenting.
This is Cynthia Yanoff, and you're listening to Pardon the Mess. Each week we have honest discussions about the ups and downs of parenting and the lessons God is teaching us along the way. It's real, it's fun, and it's biblical. Life is messy. Don't walk the parenting road alone. Hey guys, welcome to Pardon the Mess. I'm glad you're with us today. Brace yourself. We have Sally Lloyd Jones here. And if you have not heard Sally Lloyd Jones speak before, oh, you're in for such a treat, and you will not forget it, I promise. She wrote the Jesus Storybook Bible, as well as many, many, many more books for children and otherwise. And I heard her many years ago on one of my friends' podcasts, and it stuck with me, and it was just amazing. And basically, from the day Pardon the Mess started, I've wanted to have a conversation with her. And so here it is today. And what I love that she speaks into is something I think many of us face as our kids start to get older. What's my purpose? What's my significance? What does it look like in this next chapter as my kids get more independent? And she just encourages us. And she speaks in terms of writing, because that's what she does, but it's applicable to all of us. Finding those places that spark joy. What are the things that God has woven into our story? And so, there's a lot of good stuff today, but I'm going to give you a little preview because this is one of my very favorite moments of the podcast.
So I just think parents could maybe take the pressure off. And I don't, it's very hard right now, but this expectation that you have to do it all perfectly or your child's life will not be as good as it should be is a lie. Because if you did it all perfectly, you actually wouldn't be helping your child, because your child would go into the world and be completely blindsided by the world that's not perfect.
And that's exactly why you are going to want to hear this whole interview. I'm so thrilled she's with us today. Here we go with Sally Lloyd Jones. All right, Sally Lloyd Jones, welcome to Pardon the Mess. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me on.
Oh my goodness. Thank you for being here. I told you before we started recording, I'm a little giddy because I love what you do. And the Jesus Storybook Bible, let's just stop there. It's sold 10 billion copies. I'm exaggerating, but basically, and has shaped countless kids, including my own 3, still in the process of shaping my youngest. And so thank you for that. And I'm going to waste no time because you said something that I'm just going to kick this off. You were in Dallas, where I live, and you were in a podcast of a good friend of mine, Kay Wyma, and she does it from her car. And I did not know Kay Wyma back when you did this podcast. It was years ago, maybe right after the Storybook Bible came out. But you said something that I was like, I will never forget that. It has shaped me. Now, Sally, I forgot it. Okay, I need you to know that. I remembered it for a long time in the last few days as I've...
I love that. And I
forgot.
Can't possibly remember it. So there you go.
Okay, well, I went back and I listened to it again because I remember it was my first kind of introduction to you. And so I went back and listened real quick. And this is what you said. And I don't even know if I have a question, but I just want you to speak this truth because I just know somebody needs to hear it. And you said, make sure what you're calling success is what God calls success. And I remember thinking that right there is profound. As an individual, as a professional, as a parent, what are we calling success? And I just wonder if you would share with us a little bit about where did that come from? Because for every profound statement that the Lord speaks through you, I know there's a story behind it.
Oh, well, yeah, isn't it true? We all need to, you're preaching back to me because we always forget everything. I love the fact that we're called sheep. And so in many ways, we always have to be reminded, don't we? But I think in our culture right now, especially in the last few years, we're all curating our realities on Instagram and Facebook, and we're showing what we would like people to think of us. And we're all about likes and followers. And I think it's very difficult to keep tabs on what God values versus what other people value. And it's, I'm in the business of publishing and I have to sell books. So I have to do that. That's a good thing. But it goes wrong when for instance, I think this is where that comment came from, is some of my best books haven't been the most successful. In fact, one of them I would say is one of the best pieces of writing I've ever written, but it went nowhere. And it's not to justify, oh, well, I'm so great, even if my books don't sell. I'm not, obviously you have to look at the reality, but I think God used that because I felt so discouraged. And I started thinking, oh, well, it really wasn't a very good book then, was it? That's how I was thinking. Mm-hmm. And I felt like God saying, God is always after the one. He will leave 99 and he will go to seek the one. And that to him is what it's all about. So what if one, and you can fill in the blank, whatever you do, whatever your listeners do, whatever their call is. I'm going to talk about books, but it could be anything. What if one of my books doesn't sell the way everyone said it would sell, but it reaches one child with hope? Well, in God's scheme of things, he's always after the one. So it's holding that in balance that, yes, we have to, make sales and all of that, but never forget that God doesn't say, oh, that book's much more worth it because it's got all the likes and follows than the book that may have been a disappointment. So I just try and be faithful to what God has given me to do and leave. It's almost none of my business what the results are. I have to be excellent in my job and give everything to what I'm doing. But what happens is really out of all of our control. And, so that's what I try and remember.
That's so good. And it's interesting because I was listening to another podcast you were on recently, and you were saying, I mean, that wasn't always the case for you. And I love kind of the backstory to the Jesus Storybook Bible. And I wanted, again, Sally, you haven't let me down, I wouldn't say, but I really thought there was going to be this spiritual, like it was laid on my heart. I had fasted for 40 days. I was looking for that story, Sally, and instead I got, you needed money. And I love that. I love that. But can you walk everyone through what that looked like?
Yes. Well, it's God's, I just love the fact that God doesn't separate out, oh, well, this is Christian and this is not Christian. He doesn't say this tree is not Christian, but this church is Christian. He's a creator and he makes all kinds of beautiful things. And I love the fact that, I don't know why I mentioned that. I think it's because sometimes we separate things. So I was thinking, oh, if I'm writing a Bible for children, then God will, of course, he'll help me with that. Mm-hmm. But if I'm writing a book about little friends who live in a handbag, well, he can't be interested in that because it's not Christian. And that is such a lie. If Christ is at the center of your heart and redemption and joy at the center of your heart, then it won't help but come out in everything you do. Mm-hmm. And we have to be very careful not to sort of box ourselves into these weird categories, But anyway, all that to say, so with the Jesus Storybook Bible, you would expect that story of, yes, I was on a mountaintop and it was given to me. And
yes,
well, it was given to me, but it wasn't given to me like that. So I started off, the truth is God knew my call is to all children. So I knew I wasn't really, my main call was to every child and to bring them joy is what I think my calling is. So it wasn't really focused in on Bibles. I thought, well, Bibles are really for the church, which isn't really my call. My call is to every child. So I kind of would never probably have thought of writing a Bible storybook because I didn't think it was my call. So God had to put me in a position where I had no choice. So I praise him. I praise God for that. But I think it's encouragement that when things are going wrong for you and you're in a narrow place, to just say, instead of, oh no, everything's gone wrong, which it felt like to me, I'd just been laid off. I had an apartment in New York. I had no income. Everything looked dreadful. But with all my hindsight now, it was exactly the way God wanted to get me in the position where he could have me say yes to writing this book. Before I even knew what it was, I said, yes, I'll do a Bible story book because I needed the money. Mm-hmm. That was the reality. Yeah. But what happened was, as I was researching it and really living in the story, suddenly everything changed. And it was then that God gave me the book. So he didn't give me the book ahead of time so I could feel confident it was going to be a lovely thing. He got me in a position where he could give me the book. So I like to share that just because I think we have these holy ideas about the way God leads, but he leads in all kinds of ways. And it helps you in your daily life to think when things don't look good, to ask, I wonder what God might be up to have that response versus, oh no, everything's awful and it means this, because we don't really know.
Yeah. Yeah. And I love that. I love that when he takes you, like you're saying, you wouldn't have written that book but for the situation that you were in. And when I was listening to this podcast that you were speaking into, I think you referenced Joseph, and you said sometimes the promotion comes in the dungeon. I believe that was the Bible story you were referencing. But those places that, where it looks like it's the dead end, where everything's gone wrong, but that thinking of that later in terms of that was the promotion.
Absolutely. I mean, that was true for me. When I got laid off, I thought, well, this is really bad. But actually, it was how God put me in a position, and the writing the Jesus Storybook Bible, I didn't have the big enough imagination. Mm-hmm. I thought a Bible is just for the church. Well, since when is that true? That's not true. The gospel is for everyone. So of course it was in the center of my call. I just didn't realize. And so when I was researching it, suddenly the day before I would have said, I'll do a really good job. I'll write this, it'll be good. And then I'll move on to the books I'm supposed to be writing. Mm-hmm. And then the next day I would have said to you, I don't care whether I get any money for this. If I give this everything, it could be amazing. And the minute I felt that, my imagination was on fire, and I would have done it for free. Well, don't tell this on to people.
No, we'll cut that out. Don't anybody worry. What happens here stays here.
I like to share that just because it's encouraging to those of us who maybe are in the story of the dungeon and everything's gone down. But the only way Joseph could have saved God could have saved his people through Joseph was if he went to the dungeon, because going to the dungeon made him Prince of Egypt. And whatever's going on in our lives, even this pandemic right now, especially this pandemic, which has been such suffering and such tragedy, and we don't know, we can't see, and we won't know necessarily in this life, but we may have little signs every now and then of what God's doing that's good, because he won't let death and sickness have the last word. He never does that. He turns the tables on them, and they become sort of the springboard for blessing. He won't let darkness and death win.
Yeah. I think that's such great parenting application too, because I think it's so easy to be walking that road with your kids or even your family, and you're wanting to shelter your kids from these hard places, or, it doesn't look like you had thought it would look for your kids. Maybe your child struggles in school. And I think again, I keep referencing this podcast because you're just so profound, and everything, it just sticks with me. But I think during this time, it was a little bit older podcast, but you had said you had gone to visit maybe your sister or someone, and maybe your nephew or some child was experiencing some real difficulties in school, and how you had to have that reminder for your own life, but even in that child's life, that we can't see God's bigger picture always, and trusting that. And it was such a great parenting thought too.
Yeah, I just think I would love to be able to go to that question, oh Lord, I wonder what you're up to. Because if I can respond like that, it's from a place of I trust God, he's good, he's powerful. And even though I may not understand and I may not see a reason, it doesn't mean there isn't a reason. And It doesn't mean that he isn't working good in my life. So it's like working that muscle of trust. It's so simple and it's so hard. But this pandemic has stripped us of our idols that we run to. I was traveling a lot. I could go out to the movies and dinner and all these busy things that were also wonderful. And then the pandemic, and we've all got that story. And none of the things that you normally would do to feel better, you could do. Yeah. Which is very interesting. Someone said to me at the beginning of the pandemic, it's like God sent us all to our rooms to think about things.
Exactly. For a long, long time. Yeah. And just that whole notion that we want safety and security. And I think, like you're saying, it just revealed whatever our idols are. I think they became very evident through the pandemic. And I think no matter what it was, if your idol was, good health and those kind of things, or if it was your finances or your occupation and all those different areas, even just the success of your kids, whatever it is that you might have that tendency to make an idol over God, pretty much all of it was stripped away. And so then what do you do with it at the end? What does that look like? And where do you see God in that?
One of the things I've said to my nieces and nephews is, because I think it's just, they're in their early 20s. And I think for teenagers and that early 20s or late 20s, it's especially hard because I'm seeing them not graduate. I'm seeing all of that. But I said to them, just think, it's true of all of us, but for that age, I thought you'll be the generation that can say we lived through the pandemic. when you talk to your grandchildren. But also, and this is true for all of us, how amazing. God chose each of us to be here now in this pandemic. He chose that, and he'll use that in each of our lives. And I can't wait to see all of the fruit and the goodness that comes, that we may not be able to see now because it doesn't get reported. It's not news. All the goodness that's happening even in the middle of all this.
Yeah, yeah. I say this sometimes on our podcast, but it's just to think about from the time of Adam and Eve up to the second coming. At any point in that time, God could have chosen for it to be our lifetime, for us to be here on earth, but he chose now. And so you kind of go to that whole concept of Esther, like time such as this, like why did he pick now? And don't miss out on that. And it happened to be, during a pandemic. And so if we don't see it this side of heaven, one day we will absolutely know God's bigger plan, but just living. I like how you say just not staying small to stay safe, but really just living big in the Lord, even in those really hard places we face. So that's a good encouragement.
Oh, well, I hope so. I mean, I early on in the pandemic, probably this resonates with other people, is I was feeling like I've got to make the most of this time. I've just got to.
Yes.
And I couldn't write. I saw a cartoon that showed a man rowing in a rowboat with shark-infested waters, and then the bubble was, finally, I get to write the great American novel. Meanwhile, he's, in this dangerous waters. And I realized how ridiculous that is. But that's what we were all in, fight or flight. And of course, so I had to get to the point where I said to the Lord, well, I felt like him telling me, maybe making the most of the time isn't doing it the way you've always done it. Maybe it's not the treadmill of performance. Maybe it's really looking at where you get your sense of, purpose, and really looking at my relationship with him. So my prayer has been, I've ended up being able to write, which is a huge blessing. But for those first few months, I was like, well, Lord, I just have to learn to be with you. And it really showed me the idol of making the most of the time, which sounds really good, but it can become, and I know for parents, that's a big deal. Like you're making the most of the time that the children are young and under your care. But there's a tyranny in that. And it becomes, you can't rest, because when is enough? One time I thought, well, when is enough stories? How many will be enough? None. Never will that be enough.
Right.
So, and then I thought, you can get to this thing, if I've got to read all the books, I've got to know all the things. It's crazy. And then I thought, but in a second, God can give you something that would take you 10 years to come up with.
Yes. Yes. It's funny you say that. Totally. When the pandemic started, and like, we're right, as you and I are taping this, it's right at a year when kind of life shut down, and you live in New York City, and I know you can really appreciate that. But I remember the first couple of weekends, I was like, okay, every weekend I'm going to use wisely. And so I cleaned out like the junk closet one weekend. And the next weekend I went through all of my clothes and got rid of the stuff that, I was on it. And I had ordered all this stuff to help my youngest with learning and all that. And then about like 6 weeks in, like I'm just like eating Oreos and laying on the couch. I hadn't showered in days. I'm like, what just happened here? But I love that you're saying that. Yes, it's that treadmill of performance, of feeling like you've got to utilize this time and to the max, even when we're not in a pandemic. I think as parents, like you're saying, it's just that constant pressure that they're only here 18 years. And well-intentioned people say that all the time. It goes so fast, but just resting in God. And he can work in their lives and our own in a millisecond that doesn't require us to be on the treadmill to get him there.
No, I think that would be a great thing to come out of this, wouldn't it? If we could, when things go back to whatever normal is, that we don't go skipping back into high performance, as you said, using the time wisely, which sounds so good, but our wise isn't always God's wise. And God's wise might be going on a walk and talking to him, or it might be taking a nap. It might not be all these to-do lists that I have all the time. And I don't know. I don't know about you, but I'm a terrible perfectionist. And perfectionism is really, one time I said to a friend, I was really anxious about a book. And she said, well, what is it I said, I want to write a perfect book. And she said, well, what's a perfect book? And I sort of thought, well, it's probably a long book. This is insane, isn't it? But this is what my brain was telling me. And then she went, well, perfect for what? 2-year-olds or 92-year-olds or men? And I realized we have such distorted things in our heads. We don't even really question them. there is no such thing as a perfect book.
Mm-hmm.
There's an excellent book. And if you're called to excellence, you can then let go of this, whatever that is, that perfectionism that is impossible to, we don't even know what it is.
Yeah. And there's so much of that, I think, that is also influenced by what we see going around us, going on around us, like the comparison game. And I mean, I would guess, like, even as someone who I write some not nearly on the level you do, but I'm sitting here listening to you, and my temptation would be to say, oh my goodness, like the Lord's hand is all over that. And look how much, and he is, but how much he's done through you. And then think maybe I'm not seeing God's favor in that same way. And that's just not God's best. And I think we all feel that in so many ways, like in our parenting, maybe my kids aren't getting in the same colleges or aren't making the same teams, but just speaking into comparison and how have you worked through that in your life? Because I know that's got to be big, especially if you deal with perfectionism and you're also in a publishing world. That's got to be something you have to fight within yourself a lot.
Yeah, well, I love that. I can't remember who said it. Comparison is the thief of joy.
Yeah.
And we are battling comparison all the time because of Instagram and Facebook, and it's a spiritual force when you open up your phone. In a way, it's coming at you, telling you all the time you're not good enough, you're not clever enough, you're not pretty enough, or whatever it is. So I think for me, if I can keep my eyes on my narrow lane of what God's called me to. Someone once said to me, I said to a librarian, I want to write something. I was saying I was working on a book, and she said, well, I said, well, it's nothing, it's not J.K. Rowling. And she went, well, J.K. Rowling's the best at being J.K. Rowling. We don't need another J.K. Rowling. We need something from you. And I've remembered that a lot, because what we have to know is God has made us specifically in this particular way, put us in our particular place, and he has a particular plan. So for me, I need to be, if I can stay in the narrow lane of what can I write that only I can write, not in an arrogant way, but in a way to say, I need to focus on my narrow lane, because if I do that, I will do it excellently. But if I try and be sort of broad, and I mean, some people are broad and that's great, but for me, it's not right. If I try and be doing what someone else could write, then I'm not going to be very good at it. Yeah. So I think if you keep going back to God being your boss, which if I start the day and I say, Lord, this helps me with my perfectionism. Lord, here's the day. I surrender all the things I'm worried about. I surrender the whole day to you. Will you put into my day what you want me to do? And if I'm working on a particular manuscript, I'll say, Lord, unless you help me do this, I can't do it. So will you give me clues? Will you give me ideas and help me know what to do next? Then I have a so much better day than when I go steamrolling into the day and I'm like, yes, now we're going to get this done and that done and quickly and faster. And I think often hurry is a big sign that we're in the wrong place.
In the wrong place. Hurry. And when it gets really hard, I always think when things, if the burden is light and the yoke is easy, then when it's not, I have to question where God is in that. Where have I not allowed him in a situation or in something I'm facing? Hey guys, I'm jumping in here for just a minute to talk to you about Sky Ranch Camps. We love Sky Ranch. They sponsored our podcast today, and it is getting close to summer, which means it is time to be thinking about what we want this summer to look like for our kids. And I don't know about you, but I love the thought of them being outside, making lasting friendships, and being exposed to the truths of God's word. Not to mention the fact that I feel like I've told them the same thing 100 times over on any given day, and I'm never sure if they've heard me. And so it may be a great time this summer to let our kids hear a fresh voice. Sky Ranch has camp counselors that are influential, maybe just exactly what our kids need to reinforce what we're teaching at home. Their counselors are mentor-minded, highly trained, and they model confidence rooted in the gospel, and they encourage faith in our kids while playing hard. So go check it out at skyranch.org. Sign your children up for a camp that's crazy fun with a powerful purpose. And again, Pardon the Mess listeners get a $200 discount when using the code SkyParent. So go to skyranch.org and make sure you get your discount using the code SkyParent. Sally, you said something that I think is profound. Maybe I read it somewhere that you said we've got to learn to value what comes naturally to us. And I think I talk to a lot of moms, parents in general, but I speak to a lot of moms. And especially as our kids start getting older, we start to think like, oh, I'm not really that good at anything. My kids are getting older. And what is my purpose? I don't know. I see people that are really great at writing like you are, or other things out there, Sally. And I love that whole idea of like looking at what comes naturally to you and realizing that that's probably God-given gifting versus just saying, well, that's easy. That can't be it, the thing that I'm called to do. Can you encourage us in that?
Yes. I mean, I look at people, I have dear friends who are incredible hosts. They love hospitality. They thrive on having bajillion, again, I'm exaggerating, a bajillion people in their house at all times, cooking all the time. To me, that would send me into, terrible. I couldn't do it. I would be so anxious and I wouldn't be good at it. But they thrive in it and they come alive in it. And I noticed that. And I thought, I used to think that you had to be good at everything. Like, oh, well, if hospitality, I have to be really good at hospitality, just like them. So I beat myself up. But now I look at that and I think, thank goodness that we're not all the same. And in my journey as a writer, I was very unsure that I had a mix of dreaming to be a writer, always loving to write, but never thinking I was good enough. Because I thought I had to sound like a children's book writer, and it was something out there somewhere. Mm-hmm. And I would really freak out because I never felt I was good enough. So I was completely in the way. Because if you're thinking about yourself the whole time, you're not thinking about the reader, you're not letting the story through, you're completely the logjam because it's all about you. And that's sort of kiss of death. You have to get out of the way and let the story through. But a wise editor said to me, they said, I don't know. And he went, just write what makes you laugh. And I was like, well, I know what makes me, is that allowed? It was almost like as if there were these rules and I wouldn't know what they were.
Yeah.
But the minute he said, write what makes you laugh, it freed me. And I think that applies to all of us. It doesn't mean that you maybe will make a living with that thing. It may, but whatever it is that brings you fully alive, that sparks joy in you, that you just, time disappears when you're doing it, is giving you a clue as to a way that God's made you. And one of the ways I like to think about it is when you're a child about 6 or 7, before you become who you think everyone wants you to be, what were the things that you loved to do before you were really self-conscious? Mm-hmm. And they might clue you in to what you need to include in your life, whether it's in a job or just a hobby or whatever it is. Mm-hmm. Not just, hobbies are great. So that, when I was 6 or 7, I loved doing little limericks and making little comics. And so that was a clue. But it took me many years to come back to that and realize you just have to follow what is in you that God's planted.
Oh, that's so good. That's so good. And as a parent, we need to recognize those things in our kids when they're little and those things that they're naturally drawn to. And if our child is like yours, which mine aren't, but they are showing signs of being able to write and limericks and that kind of thing, then let's not be on the horse of trying to make them the best athlete in the state and get a college, whatever scholarship. Let's let them live in that and start really feeding into God's gifting in them. And so that's so encouraging.
Just as an encouragement in that, even though that's what I was doing, and I was at boarding school, and I just got the idea that I was stupid because I wasn't good at maths. And so just to encourage parents that even though I went through my childhood thinking I wasn't very clever, you can't stop what God's planted in a child. You could mess up and he will use that to help the child. So even though I thought I was stupid at maths, well, that built into something in my whole makeup that has made me maybe more able to be a writer for children. It's not like God's plan can be stopped. Yeah. Look at what he did in the Bible. Look at look at Joseph, how God's plan still was working, even when it all looked wrong. So I just think parents could maybe take the pressure off. And I don't, it's very hard right now, but this expectation that you have to do it all perfectly or your child's life will not be as good as it should be is a lie. Yeah. Because if you did it all perfectly, you actually wouldn't be helping your child, because your child would go into the world and be completely blindsided by the world that's not perfect.
Mm. Okay, I got goosebumps here, and I'm going to try to use this in the future, and I'll try to quote you, but it might become my words now. I'm just kidding. I will quote you, but that you can't stop what God's prompted in a child is about the best truth that someone's going to hear today, and encouragement, but really that is just freedom right there in parenting. So that was beautiful. Thank you. And
Well,
so
that's the gospel, isn't it? I think that's the beauty.
Well, that is
it's the beauty of the gospel, that whatever we do, no matter how awful, we can come to God and repent, and he will always be there listening and loving and welcoming us back. It's just, I mean, really a lot of what we're talking about is the beauty of the gospel. It's this incredible story that we can't get our minds around. You know, people often talk about his thoughts. My thoughts are greater than your thoughts and higher than your thoughts. I've been reading a book, Gentle and Lowly, which is a fantastic book by Dane Ortland. Anyway, he talks about how we often use that verse to say, yeah, God's ways are so mysterious and he's going to do whatever he's going to do. And kind of in a fatalistic, his ways are higher. And it's usually around something awful. But actually, the context of that is he's so much more loving and so much more merciful. And we are not like that. We are punishing, we're vindictive, and we project our stuff onto God. But his ways are higher. And he's more loving than we could imagine. So I love that perspective on that verse.
Oh, that's beautiful. We're going to link that book in podcast notes too for everyone. Sounds like a great one. Okay, and so as we're wrapping up, and we're going to talk about some of the projects you're working on and make sure everybody can find you. But there's something I wanted to ask you about as we wrap up. And the Jesus Storybook Bible has I guess I don't know if it's a subtitle or whatever. It says, "Every story whispers his name." And I thought that was so beautiful and so profound that every story whispers his name. And so I would love for you to speak into that, because I think that's so relevant to the Bible and reading it to our kids and teaching our kids that it's all speaking Jesus. But I think the same thing with creation in our lives, that it's all his story. And so could you just kind of speak into that a little bit?
Sure. I think when I realized the Bible wasn't this sort of book of rules telling me how I should live so God would love me, or the book of heroes I'm supposed to copy so God would be pleased with me. That's what I grew up thinking. Even though I was a Christian, I somehow got that idea. And when I realized the Bible is most of all this incredible love story, and it starts right in the fall. Right after the fall, God is moving towards us to save us and giving us promises and saying, you've broken my world and now sin and death will come. But I'm not going to let that be the end of it. And then the whole Bible is basically God doing everything, his initiative over and over again to say, I love you, you're my people, I'm going to come and rescue you. And when time was right, sure enough, he came down, not as a judge to punish us, but as a rescuer to save us. And so that's where that subtitle came from, because everything in the Bible is about the rescuer.
Yeah.
And then when you see that, it's just so beautiful.
Yeah.
And so hope-filled.
So hope-filled. And it reminds you in those places where you're reading through the Bible, if you're not seeing the bigger storyline, you need to go back, like you're missing it.
Yes. Yeah. And it's hard. The Bible is hard. There are portions of it where you could get lost if you didn't know the full overview of it. But it's and that often I'll say to people, well, you're probably best, if you're going to start somewhere, start with the Gospels. Start with John, or just read the Gospels and meet this God-man and see what you think.
Yeah. And that's what I love about your book. And for anyone listening who's been under a rock and missed the Jesus Storybook Bible, it's time. That is that's required literature for raising kids in today's culture, in any culture, but today's culture for the Lord. And so you've got some new projects, and I meant to ask this earlier, like, is there a certain age group that you try to write for? Is that most of your books are kind of applicable to?
I guess mostly it's up to about 12 or 13. But we put an age level on the Jesus Storybook Bible, and we quickly took it off because, old age pensioners were, people in nursing homes were reading it. So my goal is that everyone could read my books, because if you write for children with respect and you don't dumb down, but, simple isn't simplistic. Simple is finding the profound truth and putting it in words that young people can hear. Well, if you do that, then you'll get the adult too.
Okay.
C.S. Lewis said that, didn't he? There's no such thing as a book that's only good for children. A good book. There's no such thing as a good book that's only good for children.
It's only for children. Yeah. And that's how I think I've experienced the Jesus Storybook Bible, having read the Bible my whole life, but then reading it to my kids and seeing all these nuances. And I'm like, oh, look at this. Yeah. It's just, and that's the beauty of God's word too. It's so alive and active. And so you had a book recently that came out. It's called Near, and it's about Psalm 139, and it's available now in all the usual spots, I'm guessing. Do you want to tell us a touch about that?
Yes, it's basically a little board book, which I call also known as the edible edition. So it's board so that you can chew on it if you want to, because you might be a baby, and babies love them. So it's for the youngest of my readers, but it's a paraphrase of Psalm 139. And the timing of it has been a huge blessing, because of course these books take a long time to produce. But what do we need more right now than to know that God is not far away? He's not socially distant. He's very near. And so it's for little ones about that, with Jago, the illustrator of the Jesus Storybook Bible. So it's very pretty and good.
Yeah. Okay. And then you have a new one coming out in several months. Is it Cedric or Cedric? I keep forgetting.
Cedric. Well, I called him Cedric, Tiny Cedric. The smallest king that ever lived.
The smallest what?
The smallest king that ever lived.
Oh, yes. I love. You're amazing, and you're so encouraging. And I just can't thank you enough for being with us today.
Oh, well, you're a wonderful host, and I loved chatting with you. Thank you so much. By the way, I love the title of your show.
Pardon the mess. Yes.
Yes.
I mean, that's parenting.
I love it. There should be a mess. That's healthy, I think.
Agreed. A huge thank you to Sally Lloyd Jones. And before we go, I want to leave you with this messy minute. As we're wrapping up the school year, we're beginning to see all kinds of things flood our social media, from awards ceremonies, pictures with that, the great things kids are accomplishing in academics, or maybe the trophies they're receiving for great things they've done on fields, and maybe it's just college acceptances. It's really exciting stuff, but I also want you to know that it can be very difficult for so many of us, and that's okay. I know that there's many of us that have kids that didn't make the Honor Society, and they maybe never will. We have kids that didn't make the school play, or didn't get asked to prom, or maybe didn't get into the college they were hoping for. And I just want you to know that that's hard. We know that, and God knows that. But I also want you to consider this, that just because the success isn't measurable doesn't make it less worthy. In other words, it's easy to measure academic success and reward it. It's also easy to assess athletics, who's great and excels in their sports. But it's not always easy to reward and to see those kids that are just nice to others in the lunchroom, or the ones who don't take shortcuts on assignments because that's cheating. Or what about our kids that have studied really, really hard for the math test, and maybe all they're going to get is a C+, and that's a great accomplishment. We have kids that are serving in preschool, that are loving their siblings well at home. We have kids that do their quiet times in the evening before they go to bed. These are all kinds of things that need to be celebrated, but probably will never get a picture on Instagram or a certificate or a trophy. And so I just want us to remember that nothing can stop what God's planted in our children. And He rewards these things that maybe are not rewarded by our culture and our society. And just because it may not look like a big success today doesn't mean God isn't working for big things in the lives of our children tomorrow. So remind yourself of what matters to God. Kindness matters, integrity, serving others, spending time with the Lord, because great accomplishments come in lots of different sizes and shapes. And although some may not be as measurable as others, they're just as worthy of celebrating. And God's going to do that with us. We know your days are busy, so as always, thank you for joining us as we pardon the mess.